Today is our midterm examination, a moment where you do not just listen, but you evaluate, question, and test the logic itself. Before we move into those questions, I want to pause and examine something unfolding in real time, because without understanding the present, the examination loses its meaning. Recently, there has been talk of a temporary halt in tensions between the United States and Iran. A pause, not an end. And whenever you hear the word pause in geopolitics, you should immediately ask, pause for what purpose? Because pauses are rarely about peace. They are about repositioning. They are about recalculating. They are about waiting for something unseen to align. Now imagine a negotiation table being set up, not as a place for resolution, but as a stage where both sides perform cooperation while preparing contradiction. If one side presents terms that seem overwhelmingly favorable to the other, you should not interpret that as generosity. You should interpret that as strategy. Because no serious player reveals their true position at the beginning, so when extreme concessions appear early, it raises a deeper question. Is the offer real, or is it designed to provoke a reaction? Think about bargaining in its simplest form. If someone offers everything too quickly, it disrupts the logic of negotiation. It signals that something else is happening beneath the surface. And this is where the first layer of the game reveals itself. The visible conversation is not the real conversation. The real conversation is hidden in movements, in logistics, in timing. While words speak of calm, actions may suggest acceleration. And when those two do not match, you should always trust actions over statements. Now here is where it becomes more complex. Even if leadership agrees to pause, does that decision actually control the system beneath it? Because modern conflict is not always centralized. It fragments, it decentralizes. It becomes cellular. That means even if an agreement is signed at the top, the structure below may not follow. And if the structure does not follow, then the agreement exists only on paper. So now you begin to see the tension, not just between countries, but within systems themselves. Leadership versus execution, strategy versus reality. And this is where things start to break apart. Because once alignment is lost at the internal level, external agreements begin to collapse without warning. Now consider the second dimension of the situation. Movement. Not speeches, not headlines, but actual movement. When there is supposed calm, yet resources continue to shift, forces continue to gather, and positioning continues to evolve, you have to question the authenticity of the pause, because preparation during peace suggests anticipation of conflict. And anticipation of conflict means the pause is temporary by design, it is not a mistake, it is not confusion, it is intentional. Now layer onto that the complexity of decentralized defense systems. Imagine a structure where multiple units operate independently, each capable of making its own decisions. In such a structure, trust becomes fragile. Even if the top agrees, the bottom may resist. Why? Because trust is not uniform. Different parts of the system interpret risk differently. Some will see negotiation as weakness, others will see it as survival. And when those interpretations collide, the system fractures internally. This creates a paradox. The stronger the decentralization, the harder it becomes to enforce peace. Because peace requires coordination, and coordination requires trust. Without trust, enforcement becomes conflict. So even a favorable agreement becomes impossible to implement. And that leads to an important realization. The outcome is no longer determined solely by negotiation. It is determined by the structure of the system itself. Now extend this further. If both sides are experiencing internal pressures, then the conflict is no longer just external. It becomes a mirror, each side reflecting instability onto the other. And in that environment, even small incidents can escalate rapidly because there is no single point of control to contain them. So what appears as a controlled situation is actually highly unstable beneath the surface. And here is where the real danger lies. Not in what is happening openly, but in what is happening quietly, structurally, and continuously. Because once systems lose coherence, they do not collapse immediately. They drift. And during that drift, they become unpredictable, and unpredictability is where the game changes completely. Now we move into the deeper layer, the one that connects everything you are seeing. You might think this is about countries, leaders, or decisions, but it is actually about patterns. Patterns that repeat across history. Patterns that shape outcomes regardless of individual intentions. If you observe carefully, you will notice that events rarely move randomly. They follow trajectories. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but consistently enough to be recognized. And those who recognize these trajectories attempt to position themselves ahead of them. This is where belief systems, long-term visions, and strategic narratives come into play. Because if you can define the direction of the story, you can influence how others act within it. Now imagine groups of people who dedicate themselves to interpreting these patterns. They analyze, they predict, and most importantly, they construct narratives about where things are heading. These narratives are not just passive observations, they become frameworks for action. Because once a narrative is believed, it begins to shape decisions. And when decisions align with a narrative, the narrative starts to manifest. So what you are witnessing is not just random conflict. It is the interaction of multiple narratives competing to become reality. Each side believing in its own trajectory. Each side attempting to align events with its expectations. But here is the complication. These narratives are not unified. They overlap, they conflict, they evolve. And the individuals operating within them are not perfectly controlled. They adapt. They switch strategies. They respond to incentives. So the system becomes dynamic, not fixed. And this is why no single explanation ever fully captures reality. Because reality is the result of multiple forces interacting simultaneously. Some visible, some hidden, some intentional, some reactive. And as these forces collide, the direction of events shifts. Sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly. And when that shift happens, those who relied on a single narrative find themselves unprepared. So the real question for this examination is not what is happening, but how do you interpret what is happening? Because interpretation determines positioning, and positioning determines outcome. And if your interpretation is flawed, your position will be vulnerable. And if your position is vulnerable, then what happens next is not a matter of if, but when. Now let's continue, because if you stop at what we just discussed, you will misunderstand the scale of what is unfolding. The first layer showed you misalignment between words and actions. The second layer showed you structural instability within systems. But there is a third layer, and this is where things become much more subtle. It is the layer of incentives, because no system moves without incentives. Every actor, whether individual or institution, responds to pressures, rewards, and risks. And when you map those incentives correctly, you begin to see why certain decisions are made even when they appear irrational on the surface. For example, imagine a situation where prolonging tension benefits certain actors more than resolving it. In that case, peace becomes less attractive than controlled instability. Not chaos, but managed tension, because tension creates opportunities. Economic opportunities, political leverage, strategic positioning. And this is why sometimes conflicts do not end even when they could, because ending them removes the advantage that some players are currently extracting. Now think carefully. If different actors within the same system have different incentives, then their actions will diverge. One group may push for de-escalation, another may quietly sustain escalation. And from the outside it looks inconsistent, but from the inside it is perfectly logical. Each actor is maximizing its own position. So what you are seeing is not confusion. It is competition within the system itself. And that competition produces signals that contradict each other. Statements of peace alongside movements of preparation. Agreements alongside violations. Cooperation alongside suspicion. And once you recognize this pattern, you stop taking events at face value. You start asking who benefits from this exact outcome. Not in theory, but in practice. Because benefits reveal intent more clearly than statements ever will. And when you follow that line of thinking, you begin to uncover something deeper, because sometimes the system is not trying to resolve the situation at all. It is trying to maintain it at a certain level. Now extend this logic further into the economic dimension, because no prolonged conflict exists in isolation from the global economy. Supply chains shift, markets react, resources get reallocated, and these shifts create both pressure and opportunity. Certain sectors experience strain while others expand rapidly. Energy markets fluctuate, transportation routes become uncertain, financial systems adjust risk calculations. And in that environment, decisions are not just about strategy, they are about sustainability. Because if the economic cost becomes too high, even the most determined actors are forced to reconsider their position. But here is the complication. Economic pressure does not affect all players equally. Some are more resilient, some are more exposed, and those differences create asymmetry. One side may feel urgency, while the other can afford patience. And patience in strategy is power, because the longer you can sustain your position, the more options you retain. So now you have another layer influencing outcomes, not just military or political, but economic endurance. And when you combine that with the earlier point about incentives, the picture becomes clearer. Actions are not random, they are responses to a complex web of pressures. And those pressures are constantly changing, so strategies must adapt continuously. But adaptation introduces risk, because rapid changes can create mistakes, miscalculations, overreactions. And in a highly sensitive environment, even a small miscalculation can trigger a chain reaction. Not because anyone intended it, but because the system is already under tension. So stability becomes fragile, not absent, but fragile. And fragile systems do not require large shocks to destabilize. Sometimes a minor event is enough to shift the entire trajectory. And when that shift happens, it often feels sudden, even though the conditions were building over time. That is the nature of complex systems. They appear stable until they are not. And when they transition, they do so quickly. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. How do you distinguish between a temporary fluctuation and the beginning of a larger transformation? And this is where we need to step even further back, beyond immediate events, into the architecture of the system itself. Because everything we have discussed so far operates within a larger framework. A framework that defines rules, sets boundaries, and shapes possibilities. This framework is not static. It evolves, it expands, it sometimes contracts under pressure. And within it, different regions, different entities function as nodes, some central, some peripheral, some highly integrated, others loosely connected. And the behavior of each node depends on its position within the framework. Central nodes tend to stabilize the system because they benefit from its continuity. Peripheral nodes may destabilize it because they are more exposed to its weaknesses. And when stress increases, the interactions between these nodes become more intense. Central nodes attempt to preserve structure. Peripheral nodes test its limits. And the result is a dynamic tension that drives change. Now consider what happens when the framework itself comes under strain. Not just individual parts, but the underlying structure. At that point, the strategies that once worked begin to lose effectiveness. Old assumptions no longer hold. New patterns emerge, and actors who fail to recognize this shift continue operating based on outdated models. That is where mistakes happen, not because of lack of intelligence, but because of incorrect assumptions. And once enough actors operate under incorrect assumptions, the system begins to move in unexpected ways. Feedback loops accelerate, signals become harder to interpret, and decision-making becomes more reactive than strategic. So instead of guiding events, actors start responding to them. And when that happens, control diminishes, not completely, but significantly. And this is the point where the game becomes truly unpredictable. Because unpredictability is not just about randomness, it is about the breakdown of reliable patterns. And when patterns break down, forecasting becomes uncertain, positioning becomes risky, and even the most experienced players find themselves navigating without clear direction. So as you move into the next part of this examination, keep this in mind. You are not just analyzing events. You are analyzing a system in motion, a system under pressure, a system where incentives, structures, and assumptions are all interacting simultaneously. And the real challenge is not to find a simple answer, but to understand how these layers connect. Because the moment you think you fully understand it, that is usually the moment the system shifts again. So now we arrive at the final layer. And this is where the examination becomes less about observation and more about interpretation under uncertainty. Up to this point, you have seen how misalignment, incentives, and structural pressure interact. But none of that matters if you cannot make decisions in an environment where information is incomplete and constantly shifting. Because that is the real condition in which all actors operate. No one has perfect clarity. No one sees the entire system. Everyone is working with fragments, signals, and assumptions. And from those fragments, they construct a picture of reality. But here is the problem. When your picture is built on partial information, it is always vulnerable to distortion, not necessarily because someone is deceiving you, but because the system itself produces noise. Signals overlap, timelines blur, intentions get misread, and in that environment, confidence becomes dangerous. because the more certain you are, the less likely you are to adjust when new information appears. So the first principle at this level is not prediction, but flexibility. The ability to update your understanding without losing coherence. And that is much harder than it sounds, because humans prefer stable narratives. We prefer consistency. We prefer to believe that once we understand something, it will continue to behave in a predictable way. But complex systems do not reward that mindset. They punish it. They evolve faster than your assumptions. And if you do not evolve with them, you fall behind. Now consider how this affects decision making. If you act too early, you risk acting on incomplete information. If you act too late, you lose the advantage of timing. So you are constantly balancing speed against accuracy. And there is no perfect balance. Every choice carries risk. Every delay carries cost. And this is why outcomes often appear irrational in hindsight, because decisions were made under conditions that are not visible after the fact. You see the result, but you do not see the uncertainty that shaped it. And without understanding that uncertainty, you misinterpret the decision. You assume error where there may have been constraint. You assume intention where there may have been reaction. And this misinterpretation feeds back into the system, creating further distortion. Because now your analysis influences your next decision, which may be based on an incorrect understanding of the previous one. And this is how cycles of misjudgment begin to form. Slowly at first and more rapidly as errors compound, until eventually the system is no longer responding to reality, but to its own misperceptions. And that is where instability accelerates, because once perception diverges from reality, correction becomes much more difficult. Now let's push this even further into the concept of time horizons. Because not all actors are playing the same game in terms of timing. Some are focused on immediate outcomes, short-term gains, quick adjustments, rapid responses. Others are operating on longer timelines, years, decades, sometimes even generational perspectives. And when these different time horizons interact, they create friction. Short-term actors may take actions that undermine long-term stability. Long-term actors may tolerate short-term losses for future advantage. And from the outside, these behaviors can look contradictory, but they are not. They are aligned with different objectives. Now imagine a situation where both types of actors are influencing the same system simultaneously. One pushing for immediate resolution, the other willing to sustain prolonged tension. The result is not a clear direction, but oscillation. Movement back and forth, progress followed by regression, signals of stability followed by disruption. And this oscillation makes interpretation even more difficult, because every improvement may be temporary and every setback may not be permanent. So you cannot rely on single events to define the trajectory. You have to observe patterns over time. But here is the challenge. Patterns only become visible after they have already begun to influence outcomes. So there's always a lag between recognition and response. And during that lag, positioning becomes critical. If you misread the pattern, you position incorrectly. And incorrect positioning is costly, not always immediately, but eventually. Because the system will move in a direction that does not support your assumptions. And when that happens, you are forced to adjust under pressure. And adjustments under pressure are rarely optimal. They are reactive, constrained, and often too late. So the real skill is not just recognizing patterns, but recognizing them early enough to act effectively. And that requires something beyond data. It requires judgment, the ability to weigh incomplete information and still make a coherent decision. But judgment itself is influenced by bias, by prior experience, by expectation, so even this is not reliable, which means the entire process is inherently uncertain, and yet decisions must still be made. That is the paradox. You cannot wait for certainty, because certainty never arrives. You cannot ignore uncertainty, because it shapes every outcome. So you operate within it, constantly adjusting, constantly reassessing, never fully settled. And this constant adjustment creates fatigue. Not just at the individual level, but at the system level, because sustained uncertainty consumes resources, attention, and stability. And over time, that fatigue begins to show not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual weakening of coherence.